What would you do if the person who marked your childhood suddenly disappeared? For David Mercer, a simple letter sets off a quest to find Miriam, the nanny who disappeared 35 years ago. But when he discovers the truth, he is faced with a choice that could change everything. Sometimes there are unexpected ways in which our past can reshape our future. Welcome, enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. David Mercer stood at the window of his corner office, gazing out at the bustling cityscape of Toronto. At 48, he had achieved more than he'd ever dreamed possible. CEO of a thriving tech company, a penthouse in the heart of the city, and a reputation as one of Canada's most innovative entrepreneurs. Yet, as he turned the crisp envelope over in his hands, a familiar emptiness gnawed at him. The return address, scrawled in shaky handwriting, belonged to Mrs. Patel, his former next-door neighbor from childhood. David hadn't thought about her in years, let alone received a letter from her. Curiosity piqued, he carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. As his eyes scanned the page, one name leaped out at him: Miriam. His heart skipped a beat. Miriam, his childhood nanny, the woman who had been more of a mother to him than anyone else in his life. Mrs. Patel's letter mentioned running into Miriam at a local community center and provided a vague description of where she might be living now. David sank into his leather chair, memories flooding back. Miriam's warm brown eyes, her gentle hands as she tended to his scraped knees, the smell of her famous chocolate chip cookies. She had been his rock, his confidant, his safe harbor in a childhood marked by his parents, constant absence, and eventual divorce. And then one day, she was gone. No explanation, no goodbye. Just an empty space where her love used to be. For years, David had buried the pain of her departure, throwing himself into his studies and later his work. But now, with Mrs. Patel's letter in his hands, all those carefully suppressed emotions came rushing back. He picked up his phone, canceling his afternoon meetings. This was too important to ignore. As he left the office, his mind raced with questions. Why did Miriam leave? Where had she been all these years? And most importantly, would she even want to see him? The drive home was a blur. David found himself sitting in his living room, surrounded by the trappings of success, yet feeling more alone than ever. He pulled out an old photo album, something he hadn't looked at in years. There she was, Miriam, her arm around a gap-toothed 8-year-old David. Her smile was radiant, her eyes twinkling with affection. David traced the outline of her face with his finger, remembering how she would sing him to sleep on nights when thunderstorms raged outside his window. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across his living room, David made a decision. He would find Miriam. He owed her that much, to thank her for the love she had given him, to understand why she had left, and perhaps to fill the void that had been present in his life since her departure. But doubt crept in. What if she didn't want to be found? What if the Miriam he remembered no longer existed? David shook his head, pushing away the negative thoughts. He had to try. The successful businessman in him knew how to tackle challenges, how to persevere in the face of obstacles. This would be no different. With renewed determination, David reached for his laptop. He would start his search tonight. As he typed Miriam's name into the search bar, he felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. This journey, he realized, might change everything. But some things were worth risking everything for, and finding Miriam, the woman who had shaped his early years with her unwavering love and support, was one of them. As the search results populated his screen, David took a deep breath. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to take the first step. Whatever the outcome, he knew that the journey to find Miriam would be one of self-discovery, healing, and perhaps, if he was lucky, a chance to express the gratitude he had carried in his heart for all these years. The gentle hum of David's computer faded into the background as he closed his eyes, allowing himself to be transported back to a time when life was simpler, warmer, filled with the love of one remarkable woman. He was 7 years old again, sitting at the kitchen table in his childhood home. The aroma of freshly baked cookies wafted through the air as Miriam moved about the kitchen, humming a soft melody. Her dark curls were pulled back in a neat bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face. "David, mi amor," she called, her voice tinged with the warmth of her native Colombia. "Come try these cookies. I made them just for you." Young David eagerly reached for a cookie, its chocolate chips still gooey and warm. As he bit into it, Miriam ruffled his hair affectionately. "How is it, mijo?" "It's the best, Miriam," David exclaimed, his mouth full of cookie. "You make the best cookies in the whole world." Miriam's laughter, rich and melodious, filled the kitchen. It was a sound that always made David feel safe, loved, and cherished. The scene shifted, and David was now 10, tears streaming down his face as he clutched a crumpled math test. The big red F at the top of the page seemed to mock him. "I'm so stupid," he sobbed, as Miriam knelt beside him, her warm hands cupping his face. "No, mi cielo," she said firmly, her brown eyes locking with his. "You are not stupid. You are smart and kind and capable of anything you set your mind to. We'll work on this together, okay? I believe in you, David." Her words were a balm to his young soul, igniting a spark of confidence that would grow into the drive that fueled his later success. Another memory surfaced. David at 12, the day his parents sat him down and told him they were getting divorced. The world seemed to crumble around him, but there was Miriam, steady as always. She held him as he cried, her embrace a fortress against the storm of emotions. "Sometimes, life gives us lemons," she had said, wiping away his tears. "But do you know what we do with lemons, David?" "Make lemonade," he had replied, managing a weak smile. "That's right, mi valiente. We make lemonade. And I'll be right here, helping you squeeze every last drop." The adult David opened his eyes, his cheeks wet with tears he hadn't realized he'd shed. Miriam had been his anchor, his guiding star. She had shaped him in ways his own parents never could, instilling in him values of kindness, perseverance, and self-belief. As he stared at the search results on his computer screen, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. Finding Miriam wasn't just about satisfying his curiosity or easing his guilt. It was about honoring the love she had given him, about showing her the man he had become because of her influence. With a deep breath, David began to sift through the information before him. Each click, each new lead, brought him closer to the woman who had been the heart of his childhood. The journey ahead would be challenging, he knew, but the memories of Miriam's love fueled his determination. As the night deepened outside his window, David pressed on, driven by the hope of reuniting with the woman who had taught him the true meaning of unconditional love. The next morning, David woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The memories of Miriam, so vivid after his night of reminiscing, propelled him into action. He called his assistant, clearing his schedule for the next few days. This search was too important to delegate or to squeeze between meetings. His first stop was his childhood neighborhood in the suburbs of Toronto. As David drove down the familiar streets, now lined with mature trees and renovated homes, he felt a strange mix of nostalgia and disconnection. So much had changed, yet the essence of the place remained the same. He parked in front of Mrs. Patel's house, his heart racing as he approached the door. The woman who answered was older than he remembered, her once black hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes lit up with recognition. "David? Little David Mercer?" she exclaimed, ushering him inside. "My goodness, look at you now, all grown up and so handsome." Over a cup of chai, David learned more about Mrs. Patel's encounter with Miriam. It had been brief, just a passing interaction at a community center downtown where Mrs. Patel volunteered. Miriam had mentioned working with immigrant families, helping them settle into their new lives in Canada. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. David thanked Mrs. Patel, promising to keep in touch, and headed back to the city. His next stop? The community center. The center was a hive of activity, people of all ages and backgrounds coming and going. David felt out of place in his tailored suit, a stark contrast to the casual atmosphere around him. He approached the reception desk, where a young woman greeted him with a smile. "I'm looking for information about a woman named Miriam," David explained, realizing too late how vague his request was. "She might have volunteered here recently. She's in her 60s now, originally from Colombia." The receptionist's smile faded slightly. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't give out information about our volunteers or clients. It's a privacy issue." David's heart sank, but he pressed on. "I understand. Could you perhaps pass along a message if she comes in?" After some negotiation, the receptionist agreed to take David's contact information. It wasn't much, but it was something. As he turned to leave, a flyer on the bulletin board caught his eye. ESL classes for new immigrants, Volunteers needed. On impulse, David took down the contact information. If Miriam was involved with helping immigrants, this could be a way to cross paths with her. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and visits to various organizations around the city. David leveraged every connection he had, called in favors, and even hired a private investigator. But Miriam remained elusive, a shadow always just out of reach. As the week drew to a close, David found himself sitting in a small cafe, feeling defeated. He stirred his coffee absently, watching the people pass by on the busy street outside. Had he been foolish to think he could find one woman in a city of millions? Was he chasing a ghost? A memory that perhaps should have been left in the past? Just as he was about to give up for the day, his phone buzzed with a text from the private investigator. Possible lead, Miriam Suarez, working part-time at St. Michael's Hospital, volunteer in the pediatric ward. David's heart leaped. It was the first concrete lead he'd had all week. Without hesitation, he paid for his untouched coffee and hurried out of the cafe, hope surging through him once more. As he navigated through the evening traffic towards the hospital, David's mind raced. What would he say to Miriam after all these years? Would she be happy to see him, or had she left his life for a reason? The uncertainty was both terrifying and exhilarating. One thing was clear. He was closer now to finding Miriam than he had been in 35 years. Whatever happened next, David knew his life was about to change. With a mix of anticipation and anxiety, he pulled into the hospital parking lot, ready to face whatever awaited him inside. The antiseptic smell of the hospital assaulted David's senses as he stepped through the sliding doors. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of anticipation and anxiety coursing through his veins. He approached the information desk, his voice barely above a whisper as he inquired about Miriam Suarez. The receptionist eyed him curiously before checking her computer. "I'm sorry, sir. Miriam's shift ended an hour ago. She won't be back until tomorrow afternoon." David's shoulders slumped, the adrenaline that had propelled him here suddenly dissipating. "Could you tell me where I might find her? It's important." The woman's expression softened, but she shook her head. "I'm afraid we can't give out personal information about our staff or volunteers. Hospital policy." Nodding in resignation, David turned to leave. As he did, he caught sight of a bulletin board covered in colorful drawings. Clearly the work of the children in the pediatric ward. One picture in particular caught his eye. A stick figure with curly hair and a big smile labeled Miss Miriam in a child's scrawl. Emotion welled up in David's throat. This was the Miriam he remembered, always ready with a smile, always there to comfort and care. He snapped a quick photo with his phone, a tangible connection to the woman he sought. Outside the hospital, David sat in his car, unsure of his next move. On impulse, he called his private investigator again. "I need more information on Miriam Suarez. Anything you can find, where she lives, her background, what she's been doing for the past 35 years. The next day dragged by, each minute feeling like an hour as David waited for news. When his phone finally rang, he answered on the first ring. "Mr. Mercer, I've got some information for you," the investigator said. "Miriam Suarez lives in a small apartment in Regent Park. She's been there for about 20 years. She's worked various jobs over the years, mostly in childcare and social services. There's no record of her ever marrying or having children of her own." David listened intently, trying to piece together the life Miriam had lived since she left his family. What about her family? Why did she leave so suddenly all those years ago? There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's where things get interesting, Mr. Mercer. It seems Miriam had to return to Colombia rather abruptly in the late 80s. Her mother was ill, and there were some political complications. When she finally returned to Canada a few years later, she struggled to find stable employment. She's been living paycheck to paycheck ever since." The revelation hit David like a punch to the gut. All these years, he had harbored a sense of abandonment, wondering why Miriam had left without a word. Now, learning of her struggles and sacrifices, he felt a wave of guilt wash over him. "Thank you," he said quietly, ending the call. David sat in silence for a long moment, processing what he'd learned. The Miriam he'd known, vibrant, loving, always ready with a warm hug or a word of encouragement, had faced hardships he couldn't have imagined. And while he had gone on to build a successful life, she had struggled, dedicating herself to helping others despite her own difficulties. With newfound determination, David made a decision. He would go to Miriam's apartment tomorrow. He needed to see her, to understand, to make things right if he could. As he drove home that evening, the city lights blurring past his windows, David's mind was filled with memories of Miriam, her laughter, her gentle touch, the way she always made him feel safe and loved. Now, knowing the sacrifices she had made, those memories took on a bittersweet quality. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow he would finally reunite with the woman who had shaped his childhood. As he pulled into his driveway, David felt a mix of emotions, nervousness, excitement, and a deep, abiding gratitude for the love Miriam had given him all those years ago. Whatever happened next, David knew one thing for certain. He would do everything in his power to repay the kindness and care Miriam had shown him. It was time to bridge the gap of 35 years, and hopefully, bring some joy back into the life of the woman who had given him so much. The next afternoon found David standing in front of a weathered apartment building in Regent Park, his hand poised to press the buzzer for Unit 307. He hesitated, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. What if Miriam didn't want to see him? What if the years had changed her beyond recognition? Taking a deep breath, David pressed the buzzer before he could talk himself out of it. Seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then a crackle of static, followed by a familiar voice that sent a jolt through his entire being. Yes? Who is it? David's voice caught in his throat. Miriam? It's David. David Mercer. There was a long pause, then a sharp intake of breath. David? Little David? The door buzzed open, and David made his way up to the third floor, his heart pounding with each step. As he rounded the corner, he saw her, older, grayer, but unmistakably Miriam. She stood in the doorway of her apartment, one hand covering her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes. For a moment they simply stared at each other, decades of separation stretching between them. Then, as if a spell had been broken, Miriam rushed forward, enveloping David in a fierce hug. The familiar scent of her perfume, a hint of jasmine, transported him back to his childhood in an instant. "Oh, my David," Miriam whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Look at you, all grown up." David hugged her back, surprised to find tears streaming down his own face. "Miriam, I've missed you so much." They made their way into Miriam's small apartment, a cozy space filled with plants and colorful textiles that reminded David of his childhood home. As they sat on her worn but comfortable couch, the initial euphoria of their reunion gave way to a more complex mix of emotions. "I'm so sorry, David," Miriam began, her eyes downcast. "I never wanted to leave you. You must have thought... Oh, what you must have thought." David reached out, taking her hand in his. "I understand now, Miriam. I know about your mother, about the difficulties you faced. I wish I had known. I wish I could have helped." Miriam smiled sadly, patting his hand. "You were just a boy, mi amor. It wasn't your burden to bear." She took a deep breath, seeming to steel herself. "When I had to leave, it broke my heart. I wanted to explain, to say goodbye properly, but everything happened so fast. And when I finally returned to Canada, so much time had passed. I thought it would be better to let you move on with your life." As Miriam shared her story, the years spent caring for her ailing mother in Colombia, the political unrest that made returning to Canada difficult, the struggle to rebuild her life once she finally made it back, David listened with a growing sense of admiration and regret. This woman, who had given him so much love and support, had faced incredible hardships, yet she had never lost her spirit of kindness and generosity. "I've thought of you so often over the years," Miriam said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've wondered how you were, if you were happy. I saw your name in the newspaper once, talking about your company. I was so proud, David, so proud of the man you've become." David felt a lump form in his throat. "Everything I am, everything I've achieved, it's because of you, Miriam. The love and support you gave me, the values you taught me, they've shaped my entire life." As the afternoon wore on, they continued to talk, bridging the gap of 35 years. They laughed over shared memories, cried over lost time, and slowly began to rebuild the bond that had meant so much to both of them. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through Miriam's small living room, David realized that this reunion was not an ending, but a beginning. He had found more than just his long-lost nanny. He had rediscovered a vital part of himself, a connection to the love and warmth that had shaped his early years. Looking at Miriam's smiling face, David made a silent promise. He would make sure that the woman who had given him so much would never again have to face life's challenges alone. The journey that had brought them back together was just the first step in a new chapter of their shared story. In the weeks following their emotional reunion, David found himself visiting Miriam's apartment regularly. Each visit peeled back another layer of the years they had spent apart, revealing both joys and sorrows. David marveled at Miriam's resilience, how she had faced adversity with grace and continued to give of herself to others despite her own hardships. One evening, as they sat sharing a meal of Miriam's famous ajiaco, a Colombian soup that had been David's childhood favorite, he decided it was time to broach the subject that had been on his mind since their first meeting. "Miriam," he began, setting down his spoon, "I want to help you. You've given so much to me, to countless others. Let me give something back." Miriam's brow furrowed, a flicker of pride crossing her face. "David, mi amor, you don't owe me anything. Seeing you, knowing the wonderful man you've become, that's all the reward I need." David leaned forward, his voice earnest. "It's not about owing, Miriam. It's about family. You are family to me. Please, let me help make your life a little easier." He outlined his proposal. A comfortable apartment in a better neighborhood, closer to the hospital where she volunteered. Financial support that would allow her to focus on her volunteer work without worrying about making ends meet. Perhaps even a fund to help other immigrant families, in her name. Miriam listened, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. When David finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "It's too much, David. I can't accept all this. I don't want to be a burden." "A burden?" David echoed, shaking his head. "Miriam, you've never been a burden. You're a gift. Everything I'm offering, it's just a small fraction of what you've given me. Please, let me do this for you." Miriam stood up, moving to the window. She gazed out at the city lights, her reflection in the glass showing a mix of emotions, gratitude, hesitation, and a hint of fear. "It's a beautiful offer, David. But I've been on my own for so long. I'm not sure I know how to accept such generosity." David joined her at the window, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You taught me that family takes care of each other. Let me take care of you now, the way you once took care of me." Turning to face him, Miriam searched David's eyes. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her. Slowly, a smile spread across her face, the warm, loving smile that David remembered from his childhood. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, mi querido. If you're sure. I accept." David pulled her into a hug, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. This was right. This was what family did for one another. As they pulled apart, Miriam wiped a tear from her cheek. "But I have one condition," she said, a hint of her old playfulness returning to her voice. "You must let me continue my volunteer work, and," she paused, a twinkle in her eye, "you must come over for Ayako at least once a month." David laughed, his heart light with joy. "Deal," he said, sealing the promise with another hug. As they returned to their cooling soup, David felt a sense of completion he hadn't known he was missing. He had not only found Miriam, but had also rediscovered a part of himself. In offering Miriam a new beginning, he realized, he had given himself one as well. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and the warmth of rekindled family bonds. Whatever challenges lay ahead, David knew that they would face them together, strengthened by the love and loyalty that had brought them back into each other's lives after 35 years apart. The months following David's reunion with Miriam brought about a transformation in both their lives. True to his word, David had helped Miriam move into a comfortable apartment in a vibrant neighborhood near St. Michael's Hospital. The new space, bathed in natural light and featuring a small balcony perfect for Miriam's beloved plants, quickly became a warm and welcoming home. At first, Miriam had been hesitant about the change. worried about losing her connection to the community she had been a part of for so long. But David had been thoughtful in his planning, ensuring that Miriam could easily visit her old neighborhood and continue her volunteer work. As summer turned to fall, David found himself spending more and more time with Miriam. Their relationship, once defined by the roles of nanny and child, evolved into a deep friendship between equals. They shared meals, swapped stories, and often simply enjoyed each other's company in comfortable silence. One crisp October evening, as they sat on Miriam's balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues, David realized how much his life had been enriched by Miriam's presence. The void he had felt for so long was filled, not just by memories of the past, but by the joy of building new experiences together. "You know, David," Miriam said, her eyes twinkling with mischief, "I think it's time you learned to make a giaco yourself. You can't expect an old woman to cook for you forever." David laughed, remembering the disasters that had occurred in his kitchen when he'd tried to recreate Miriam's recipes in the past. "I'm not sure the world is ready for my culinary experiments, Miriam." "Nonsense," she replied, patting his hand. "You just need a good teacher, and lucky for you, I happen to know one." The following weekend found them in Miriam's kitchen, the air filled with the aroma of simmering chicken and herbs. As Miriam guided David through the steps of making the soup, she shared stories of her own mother teaching her to cook back in Colombia. "Food is love, mi querido," she said, showing him how to properly cut the potatoes. "When we cook for others, we're not just feeding their bodies, but their souls too." As they worked side by side, David felt a sense of coming full circle. Here he was, learning from Miriam just as he had as a child, but now with the added perspective of an adult who understood the value of these moments. When the soup was finally ready, they sat down to enjoy it together. David took a spoonful, the familiar flavors transporting him back to his childhood kitchen. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Miriam beamed at him, her eyes shining with pride and affection. "See? I told you you could do it. You just needed to believe in yourself." As they continued their meal, David realized that these simple moments of connection and care, was what he had been missing all along. Success and wealth were meaningless without the warmth of family and the joy of shared experiences. Looking at Miriam across the table, her face animated as she recounted a funny incident from her volunteer work, David felt a profound sense of gratitude. By reconnecting with Miriam, he hadn't just reclaimed a piece of his past, he had gained a richer, more fulfilling present and the promise of a future filled with love and purpose. As the evening wore on, their laughter echoing through the apartment, David knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in their shared story. Together, they were building a life that honored their past while embracing the possibilities of the future. 1 year after their reunion, David and Miriam stood side by side in the community center where their journey had begun. The room was filled with immigrants new to Canada, volunteers and social workers, all gathered for the launch of the Miriam Suarez Foundation. David watched with pride as Miriam addressed the crowd, her voice strong and clear despite her initial nervousness. She spoke of her own experiences as an immigrant, the challenges she had faced, and the importance of community support. "Each of us has the power to make a difference in someone's life," Miriam said, her eyes scanning the room. "Sometimes it's through grand gestures, but more often, it's through small acts of kindness and understanding. This foundation is not just about providing financial support. It's about creating a network of care and compassion for those who are building new lives in this beautiful country." As applause filled the room, David felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Mrs. Patel, the neighbor whose letter had set this whole journey in motion. "You did good, David," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Who would have thought that my little letter would lead to all this?" David smiled, thinking of the twists and turns that had brought him to this moment. Sometimes, Mrs. Patel, the smallest actions can lead to the biggest changes. As the event wound down, David and Miriam found a quiet moment together. "Thank you, David," Miriam said, squeezing his hand. "Not just for this," she gestured around the room, "but for everything, for finding me, for bringing me back into your life." David shook his head, feeling a lump in his throat. "No, Miriam. Thank you. You gave me so much as a child, and now you're teaching me how to give back." They looked out at the room, at the people whose lives would be touched by the foundation. In that moment, David knew that this was just the beginning. The story that had started 35 years ago in a suburban Toronto home was continuing, evolving into something bigger than either of them could have imagined. As they stepped forward to mingle with the guests, David and Miriam moved not just as individuals, but as a team united by a shared past and a common vision for the future. Together, they were ready to write the next chapter of their story, one of hope, compassion, and the enduring power of love to transform lives. What would you do in David's place? What did you think of the story? Please leave a comment with your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'm sure there will be new videos on this channel that will surprise you. Give it a like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. See you soon.